I'm Lena Carter, 28 years old, a pediatric nurse living in Austin, Texas. I've spent the last decade building a life rooted in responsibility and compassion, qualities that once felt like survival mechanisms in my family. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stepped back into my childhood kitchen and found a note taped to the refrigerator that shattered everything I thought I had left. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most, hit that subscribe button and share this story. You're not alone. The lights were dim. The house, unusually quiet. I had flown in a few days early to surprise my grandfather for the holidays, Grandpa Walter, the only person in my family who had ever truly shown up for me. But instead of holiday cheer or the smell of something cooking, I walked into cold silence and the smell of stale bread. Grandpa sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, struggling to cut a sandwich with trembling hands. No one else was home. I moved closer, confused, and that's when I saw it. The note stuck to the fridge door. Used your money for Ryan. Watch him this week. Enjoying Cancun. Mom and Dad. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. My savings? They used my savings? My heart pounded as the words burned into my chest. I had spent 4 years putting away every spare dollar, nights working double shifts, skipping vacations, saying no to things I desperately wanted, all for that $23,000 I'd saved for my student loans. Money I kept in a separate account, an account my mother insisted on co-managing for safety. Gone. Just like that. I turned to Grandpa, whose eyes met mine with quiet shame. "They left 3 days ago," he said softly. "I haven't had a real meal since." Something inside me cracked, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I dropped my bags and walked straight to him. "Why didn't you say anything?" He gave me a half smile, more sad than amused. "Didn't want to bother you, sweetheart. Figured they'd be back soon." I looked around the kitchen. Sink full of dishes, expired condiments in the fridge, empty bread bag, no milk, no fresh food. This man, who taught me how to tie my shoes, change a tire, and stand up for myself, had been left behind like a forgotten piece of furniture. And Ryan? My brother? The one who's been in and out of trouble for years? Not here. "Where's Ryan?" I asked. Grandpa's face tightened. "He took the car yesterday morning. Said he'd be back in a few hours. Still hasn't shown." So not only had my parents stolen from me, they'd dumped my struggling brother on a vulnerable elderly man and vanished to sip cocktails in Cancun. I sat down hard on the floor, back against the fridge. My knees gave out, but it wasn't from weakness. It was from the full realization that I had been used again. 4 years of sacrifice, of skipped lattes and late nights, traded in for someone else's escape. Grandpa sat beside me, joints cracking as he lowered himself carefully. "They'll regret this, Lena," he murmured, squeezing my hand. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But one thing I knew for sure, I wasn't going to stay silent this time. I looked at Grandpa, at his shaking hands and tired eyes. And I knew something had shifted. A line had been crossed. I wasn't the girl who kept quiet anymore. And what I did next, well, it changed everything. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I tucked Grandpa Walter into bed with a proper meal in his stomach and extra blankets to fight the December chill, my body wouldn't rest. I lay in my old childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, everything in that space unfamiliar and yet too familiar at once. The peeling poster of a band I no longer listened to, the bookshelf lined with nursing textbooks and broken picture frames, the scent of something stale, maybe memory, but it wasn't the nostalgia keeping me up, it was the rage, quiet, pulsing, deeply personal, because what happened with that fridge note wasn't random, it was just the latest result of a pattern that had started long before I ever left this house. A pattern that had shaped who I became, and who Ryan was allowed to become. I was 16 when everything started to slide. Dad lost his job at the auto shop. Mom picked up hours at a local craft store, but it barely covered groceries. While my friends bought prom dresses and talked about senior trips, I stocked shelves at Dawson's Grocery from 5 p.m. to midnight. Then I'd be up at 5 a.m. to deliver newspapers on my bike before school. Not because anyone made me. No one even asked. I just saw the water rising and instinctively started bailing. Meanwhile, Ryan, who was 11, got to stay on his baseball team and keep his Gamebox subscription. "He's just a kid," Mom said. "He needs stability." I was just a kid too, but apparently I didn't need any of that. I didn't complain, I didn't question, because when you're told you're the strong one, you think you're being praised, until you realize it's a justification for your needs being ignored. At 19, I had saved enough to start prerequisites at community college. I worked full-time as an orderly at Mercy General, then part-time at a local clinic. Every month, I transferred $800 to a savings account my mom called the Future Fund. She'd convinced me to list her as a joint owner. "We'll keep it safe," she said. "Young people get taken advantage of by banks." The irony isn't lost on me now. 4 years of skipped vacations, clearance meals, and secondhand shoes, all for that fund. All for a version of freedom I never actually got to touch. And then there was Grandpa. He was the only one who ever noticed the toll that life was taking on me. When I needed to breathe, I'd go to his little ranch-style house on the edge of town. He'd have tea ready or chili on the stove, and a project we could work on together. Changing oil, fixing loose boards, replacing faucet washers. He made me feel seen. "Backbone before wishbone," he'd say, sliding a wrench across the porch as we replaced a busted railing. I never forgot that. But standing there in the kitchen now, watching him struggle to hold a coffee cup steady, I realized something awful. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd abandoned him too, and if I didn't draw a line here, none of us were going to survive the next storm. Morning came, but the heaviness in my chest didn't lift. After making Grandpa Walter a hot breakfast, his first in days, I sat across from him at the kitchen table, watching as he carefully maneuvered his fork through scrambled eggs, hands shaking slightly with each movement. He smiled at me like I'd just served him something gourmet, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop from crying. Ryan should have been here. This was his responsibility, his time to step up. But once again, he was gone when it mattered. And that was never new. His unraveling didn't start yesterday. It began years ago, one missed homework assignment at a time. At 14, he was skipping school. At 16, Dad found weed in his jacket. "It's normal teenage rebellion," they said. At 18, Ryan had been kicked out of his third high school, but Mom still packed his lunch and told the neighbors he was just figuring things out. I used to wonder if I was imagining the favoritism. I'd second-guess myself, wondering if maybe I was just jealous. But no, this was real. While I learned how to stretch a paycheck and buy off-brand cereal, Ryan got designer sneakers and new gaming consoles. When I asked for a new backpack my senior year, Mom said we needed to be tight with money. 2 weeks later, Ryan got a $200 pair of headphones because he needs to focus when he studies. He wasn't studying, but I stopped keeping track. Because the truth was, if I noticed too much, I'd have to admit how little I actually mattered in this house. Meanwhile, Grandpa's condition was getting worse. His handwriting was harder to read, his voice more tired each time we talked on the phone. I mentioned it to Mom once, suggested she take him to a neurologist. She changed the subject. "Did I tell you Ryan's thinking about enrolling in community college next fall?" That's how it always went. Every issue was deflected, minimized, replaced with some half-hearted update about my brother's latest fresh start. But there was never any real plan, no structure, just blind hope and a wallet. And now, here we were. I glanced at the wall clock. Ryan had been gone over 30 hours. No call, no text, just silence. I opened the fridge again, a jar of mustard, a pack of sliced cheese, one limp apple. That was it. My parents didn't just steal my savings, they left a man with Parkinson's alone in a house with no food, no support, and a grandson who hadn't shown his face in more than a day. Something in me hardened. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I'd spent years being the backup plan, the afterthought. But this time, I was going to be the one who decided what happened next. It wasn't the first time they'd erased him. 2 years ago, on Christmas Day, I flew home early, unannounced, to surprise Grandpa Walter. I was tired, but excited. It had been a rough fall semester at nursing school, and I wanted one quiet day with the one person who never made me feel like a burden. When I walked through his front door, I knew something was wrong. The house was cold, silent. There were no smells of cooking, no lights on in the living room. I found him in the kitchen making a sandwich, turkey from a deli pack and the heel of a bread loaf. "I thought you were going to Mom and Dad's for dinner," I asked, setting down my bag. He shrugged. "They called this morning, said Ryan was sick, postponed it." But the way he avoided eye contact? I knew it wasn't the full truth. Something didn't sit right, so I told him to get his coat. 10 minutes later, we pulled into my parents' driveway. The living room windows glowed with light, silhouettes of people moving inside. And there they were, my entire family, my parents, my aunt and uncle, cousins, and Ryan, very much not sick, laughing with a plate of food in his lap, in front of a fireplace crackling beneath garland. No one looked surprised to see us. They looked mildly inconvenienced. Mom opened the door with her wineglass in hand. "Oh, we didn't think you'd come home this year." No apology, no explanation. She turned to Grandpa. "There wasn't enough ham." That night, we sat on his back porch swing. It was freezing, but neither of us felt like going inside. He sipped his tea slowly, staring out across the yard. "Someday," he said, voice soft, "we'll both stand up for ourselves when it counts." I nodded, pretending to believe him, but deep down, I didn't think either of us ever would. I was wrong. Because now, sitting in this same kitchen, watching him carefully clean his plate with trembling fingers, I knew that someday had finally arrived. They hadn't just forgotten him, they chose to leave him behind. And that was the moment I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. The day after that memory resurfaced, something in me shifted from quiet hurt to cold resolve. I stood in that same kitchen, the one where Grandpa Walter had been left with nothing but condiments and dry bread, and I started to see the house differently, not as the place where I grew up, but as a mirror of what my family had become. The sink was full of dishes, stained with food from meals no one finished. The countertop overflowed with unopened mail, some of it stamped "Final Notice" in angry red ink. A half-filled bottle of prescription painkillers sat next to expired vitamins and a cracked coffee mug. I opened the refrigerator again. Still nearly empty. 2 slices of processed cheese, a bottle of mustard, a jug of milk that expired last week, not a single item that resembled care or effort, just enough to say, "We didn't forget you," while proving the opposite. Then I saw the calendar on the wall. December's page was curling at the corners. None of the boxes were filled in. No notes, no reminders. Except one, written in Mom's handwriting. Cancun, 12/22 to 12/30. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to take a tropical vacation after draining your daughter's savings and leaving your elderly father with no food and no transportation. "Where's Ryan?" I asked Grandpa again, though I already knew he wouldn't have an answer. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "He came by yesterday morning, borrowed $20, took my car, said he'd be back in a few hours." That had been over 36 hours ago. I grabbed my phone, tried calling my parents, straight to voicemail. I tried Ryan, nothing, not even a "sorry, can't talk right now." Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you they've already moved on, and you're the only one who's still holding on to the mess. When I stepped into Ryan's room, the mess was no longer metaphor. It was everywhere. The first thing I noticed was the new gaming console, still warm from use. Next to it sat a stack of unopened designer clothes, tags still attached. I recognized the brand from a store I couldn't afford to walk into. A small digital scale rested beside a bag of torn pill packets, and the sharp glint of a razor blade reflected the light from the desk lamp. And beneath it all, Grandpa's name on a half-used prescription bottle, his heart medication. My stomach turned. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had taken our grandfather's medication and disappeared. When I confronted Grandpa about it, he looked so ashamed it hurt to watch. "He said he was going to the pharmacy for me," he whispered. "Said he'd pick up the refills. I gave him the bottles so they'd get the dosage right." I didn't have the heart to tell him what I'd seen upstairs. I didn't need to. He already knew. His hands, folded in his lap, were trembling harder now, not just from Parkinson's, but from guilt. "You've been eating sandwiches since Tuesday," I said softly. He nodded. "Can't manage the stove anymore. Hands won't hold the pans steady." I helped him to the living room, settling him onto the couch, and as he leaned back against the cushions, eyes closed, I looked around the house again, not just for signs of Ryan, but for signs of life, and found none. That's when I understood. They hadn't just left him behind this time, they'd stopped seeing him as real altogether, and now, if I didn't do something, he would simply disappear. I didn't even hear the doorbell at first. I was still standing in the hallway, holding one of Grandpa Walter's empty prescription bottles in my hand, trying to decide if I was more furious or heartbroken. Then the chime rang again, sharp, insistent, slicing through the tension like a blade. When I opened the front door, I was surprised to find Mrs. Holloway standing there, bundled in a gray coat and holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Her eyes scanned my face, and I could tell she knew something wasn't right. "Oh, Lena," she said, pulling me into a gentle hug. "Thank God you're here." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes already darting around the room, landing briefly on the stack of unopened mail and then the empty dish rack in the kitchen. "I've been worried about your grandfather," she said, lowering her voice. "And that brother of yours, he's been having loud parties. 3 nights ago, there were at least 15 cars parked up and down the street. Music, shouting. I called your parents, but your mother told me, and I quote, 'Boys need to blow off steam.' Then she hung up on me." She set the casserole down on the counter with a sigh. "This isn't just neglect anymore, Lena. It's willful." I didn't correct her. I couldn't. Because she was right. After she left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the foil-covered casserole like it was a lifeline. Then I picked up my phone and called Jasmine. She answered on the second ring. "Lena?" Her voice was instantly alert. "I need your help," I said, my voice shaking. "It's bad, like, worse than I thought." I told her everything, about the stolen savings, the note on the fridge, the state of the house, the missing medication, Ryan's disappearance, Grandpa's condition, the scale, the pill packets, the gaming system, the unopened designer clothes. There was a long pause on the other end. "Check your credit report," she said, her voice sharp now. "Immediately. If they accessed your student fund, they might have done more." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I opened the credit app on my phone, hands trembling. And then I saw it. No new accounts, but my savings account had been drained gradually, smaller withdrawals over the past 6 months, leading up to a final transfer 3 days ago, the day they left for Cancun. Every withdrawal authorized by Caroline Carter, my mother, and I had let her keep joint access since I was 19. My stomach dropped. I called the bank, trying to stay calm. The rep confirmed it. "All transactions were made by an authorized user," she said. "The account holder is listed as Lena Carter, with joint access to Caroline Carter. You'd need to file a formal dispute, but legally?" I didn't hear the rest. I was already sliding down the wall of the hallway, landing hard on the wood floor, the bottle still in my hand. They didn't just take my money. They took my trust. And worse, They used it to keep Ryan afloat, to fund their escape, and to leave Grandpa in this crumbling house with nothing but silence and pills he no longer had. The house was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the porch light outside. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, it smothered. I sat there on the hallway floor for what felt like hours, the credit report still glowing on my phone screen. The $23,000 I had sacrificed years for, gone. Not in one fell swoop, but in calculated pieces, like they were peeling it away from me slowly, confident I'd never notice. And maybe that was the worst part. They knew I wouldn't say anything. They counted on it. When I finally stood, my legs were numb. I needed to move, to focus, or I was going to break in half. So I started cleaning. Dishes first, then the counter. Then I gathered the unopened mail, bills mostly, some months overdue, and started sorting them by urgency. Water, power, medical. Grandpa's name on every envelope, his life hanging in balance, unpaid and unnoticed. When I opened the pantry, my stomach turned. 4 boxes of crackers, 3 cans of soup, 1 half-empty jar of peanut butter. Nothing that resembled a real meal, nothing with nutrients, just filler. And not even enough of that. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I should have been sleeping. But instead, I found myself opening Grandpa's medicine cabinet, scanning for his current prescriptions. There were only a few left, and none of the ones he actually needed to function. No carbidopa, no beta blockers, no anti-anxiety pills, just an outdated bottle of Tylenol and a sleep aid that expired last year. Panic started to creep up my throat. "Grandpa," I said gently, walking back into the living room, "where are your meds?" He looked up from the TV, where an old black-and-white Western was playing. "Ryan was supposed to pick them up yesterday," he said. "I gave him the list, and the bottles for the pharmacist." His eyes dropped, ashamed. "He never came back." I could feel the walls closing in. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just nodded, then grabbed my keys. Mercy Pharmacy was already closed. No late hours for the holidays. But I found the emergency contact taped to the door and called the on-call pharmacist. I explained everything, politely but urgently. By some miracle, she agreed to meet me in 30 minutes to fill the critical medications. I almost cried from gratitude. When I returned with the paper bag of pills, Grandpa had dozed off on the couch, his chest rising and falling softly beneath a threadbare blanket. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not just older, but diminished. I tucked the blanket around his shoulders and sat beside him, holding the medication bag like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. That night, I didn't sleep in my room. I stayed on the couch in case he woke up confused or shaking, but really, I stayed because I didn't trust the silence anymore. By morning, the house felt heavier, not in noise, but in truth. I watched the sun filter through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floorboards. In the light, every neglected corner became impossible to ignore. Cobwebs stretched between the ceiling beams. Water stains crept like bruises across the living room ceiling. The wooden banister wobbled when I touched it, as if one hard pull would bring it down. None of this had happened overnight, just like Ryan's choices. Just like my parents' silence. Just like the way they stopped seeing Grandpa as someone worth caring for and started treating him like a burden they could forget. When I brought Grandpa his medication with a glass of water, he sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old photo album. I recognized the cracked brown leather cover instantly. It was one he kept tucked away behind the bookshelf in the hallway closet, one he didn't open often. He didn't look up as I approached. His fingers gently traced a faded photo of my mother, Caroline, maybe 17, standing next to her younger brother, James. James was grinning, holding a fishing pole. My mom stood stiff beside him, unsmiling. "She always resented how easy things came to him," Grandpa Walter murmured. "How your grandmother fussed over him, gave him the benefit of the doubt. Caroline used to say, 'No one notices the quiet ones.'" He flipped the page. "Now she's doing the same thing with Ryan." The words hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. Because he wasn't wrong. That photo album held more than memories. It was evidence, a visual map of our family's patterns. My 5th birthday, I sat in the background, watching Ryan open my gifts because he's excited for you, Mom had said. My high school graduation, me in my valedictorian gown, smiling with forced pride, while Ryan, front and center, held the camera and made jokes during the ceremony. Last Christmas, Ryan on the couch, buried in gifts, me in the corner with a sweater and a $15 bookstore card. I wanted to believe they were trying, that maybe they didn't know better, that maybe they were protecting him because he struggled more, but the truth was simpler. They didn't expect Ryan to be strong, so they gave him permission to fall apart. They expected me to be strong, so they gave me nothing. I didn't say anything as Grandpa turned another page, but I felt the shift inside me, the click of something locking into place. This wasn't just carelessness, it was a system, and we were all living inside it. My phone chimed, a notification from the student loan servicer, the first payment due in 30 days. I stared at it, fingers tightening around the phone. That money, the money I'd saved to keep my future intact, was now paying for resort cocktails and Ryan's mess. My net worth had evaporated, and all I had left were overdraft warnings and frozen dinners in a pantry I didn't even live in. I should have moved the money out of that account years ago, I muttered. Hindsight's only useful if you act on it, Grandpa said without looking up. What matters now is what you do next. That's when I made the decision. I was going to stop cleaning up after everyone else's messes. If they wanted a crisis, they were about to see what happened when I stopped cushioning the fall. After that morning, I couldn't sit still. It was like the air inside the house had changed. Too thick, too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. I moved from room to room with a notebook, documenting everything I'd ignored before. Not just because I needed clarity, but because I finally understood. I wasn't just picking up the pieces anymore. I was preparing for a fight. I started in Ryan's closet. Designer labels hung neatly on hangers, untouched. Shoes still in boxes. Receipts tucked into the pockets of a $600 jacket. And beneath all of it, another prescription bottle with the label half ripped off, along with an envelope from a payday loan company, unopened. This wasn't just neglect. It was indulgence funded by destruction. And we all paid for it. Especially Grandpa Walter. In the hallway, I passed by the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My face was the same, but harder. My jaw clenched tighter. My eyes no longer searched for understanding. They looked for evidence. I headed to the living room and found Grandpa sitting quietly on the couch, a bank statement spread across his lap. He didn't look up when I entered. "They took my money too," he said softly, pushing the paper toward me. I scanned the statement. A $30,000 withdrawal, marked as a home renovation transfer, nearly half his retirement savings, dated 6 months ago. "Caroline said it was a loan," he whispered. "For remodeling the kitchen. Said they'd pay me back monthly." My throat tightened. "Did they?" He shook his head. "There was always something with Ryan. A medical bill, a therapy deposit, a car repair. Eventually, I stopped asking." I lowered myself beside him, the weight of it all sinking deeper into my spine. This wasn't a one-time betrayal. This was systemic, strategic. They had drained my savings and his retirement just to keep Ryan afloat. No accountability, no intention of repayment. Just one big sinkhole of chaos and denial they expected us to patch. "I remember when Ryan wrecked Dad's old Camry," I said quietly. "They used my graduation money to buy the replacement." Grandpa nodded, lips tight. "And when they borrowed your college fund for that wilderness therapy program, the one he left after 2 days." I remembered that too well. I'd gotten a rejection letter from my dream university the same week. My mother said it was just not meant to be. But it had been, until they took it from me. As the afternoon sun slid across the floorboards, I spread our documents across the coffee table. Statements, loan papers, medical bills. I highlighted names, dates, amounts. I created a spreadsheet and started a digital folder. Everything would be backed up to the cloud. Because this wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a case file. And when the time came, I wasn't going to rely on memory or emotion. I was going to rely on proof. We were done being their collateral damage. By the time the sun dipped behind the oak trees out back, the coffee table looked more like a war room. Documents stacked in labeled piles, a spreadsheet on my laptop with color-coded tabs, a notepad filled with timelines, transactions, and the kind of details I used to think didn't matter in families. But this wasn't just family anymore. This was a pattern, one that had cost both me and Grandpa everything we'd spent years trying to protect. I knew we couldn't confront my parents yet, not without knowing where Ryan was, because like always, the mess circled back to him. He was the spark, the smoke, and the excuse, and this time, I wasn't willing to let them shift the blame again. So I turned to the only place he never thought to hide, his Instagram. It wasn't locked. It never had been. Ryan wanted the world to see him, but only the version he curated: sneakers, parties, expensive watches, moody selfies with captions like "Trust no one." And in between all that, the real clues: locations tagged, background details, timestamps. The most recent post was from 11:42 p.m. the night before, a photo of him at a party, slumped on a couch with a red Solo cup in one hand, eyes glassy, surrounded by people who didn't know him, didn't care to. The geotag read, Lakeview Drive, Austin. I zoomed in, recognized the marble countertop, the white-paneled walls. Maxwell Thompson's house, I said out loud, more to myself than to Grandpa. Maxwell, Ryan's old friend from middle school, the one whose parents were always traveling. The one with the lakefront house, unlocked wine cabinet, and a basement that had become a teenage free-for-all. We'd found our starting point. The next morning, I made Grandpa breakfast, arranged his medications in a pill organizer, and left a list of emergency contacts on the fridge. Then I grabbed my keys and drove to the edge of Oak Ridge Estates. It was all too familiar. The pristine front lawn, the BMW in the driveway, the silence that told you someone should be home but didn't want to answer the door. I rang the bell twice. No response. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the smell hit me first. Weed, stale beer, and something burnt. Trash overflowed from the kitchen bin. Pizza boxes stacked on the table. The TV blared a video game demo on loop. I moved slowly through the house, past the den, past a group of kids passed out on the living room floor, one of them snoring into a beanbag chair. No Ryan. I climbed the stairs and found him in the guest bathroom. He was hunched over the toilet, pale and sweating. A half-empty bottle of vodka on the floor. Next to it, a small tray covered in crushed pills. Oxy, Xanax. Maybe more. I couldn't even tell. Lena? His voice cracked as he looked up, blinking hard like he wasn't sure if I was real. Come on, I said, kneeling next to him. You're going home. He tried to argue, but his body was too far gone. His limbs trembled, his pupils were dilated, his skin cold and damp. Maxwell poked his head in and shrugged. Rough night. Get out of the way, I snapped, guiding Ryan to his feet. The ride home was quiet, except for the occasional groan from the passenger seat. I didn't ask questions. I didn't scold him. Because what I saw that morning wasn't rebellion or selfishness. It was collapse. And that scared me more than anything. By the time we got back to the house, the morning light was harsh, too honest. It poured through the living room windows, highlighting every crack in the walls, every smudge on the hardwood floor, every truth I had tried to ignore for far too long. I helped Ryan to the couch. He collapsed into the cushions, his eyes fluttering shut almost instantly. There was no strength left in his body to argue or explain. He had burned through every ounce of defiance. I stood there for a moment, just watching him. My little brother. The boy who used to chase fireflies with me barefoot in the backyard. The boy I once protected from monsters under the bed. Now, the monster lived inside him, and still, I couldn't look away. I covered him with the old quilt Grandma May had made years ago and turned to check on Grandpa. He was still asleep in his room, the door cracked slightly open, peaceful, breathing slow, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the house. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Jasmine. I answered quietly. "You found him?" she asked, voice tight with concern. "Yeah. Passed out at Maxwell Thompson's. Pills, alcohol, everything." Jesus. I rubbed my eyes. I can't keep doing this, Jazz. I can't keep being the net they fall into every time they screw up. You won't. Not this time. Her words hung there, steady, not full of comfort, but of conviction. And I knew she was right. I glanced at the manila folder I had started the day before, labeled Evidence. I opened it again and began sorting the new pieces. A photo of the pill tray, a screenshot of Ryan's Instagram post, notes about the loan Grandpa never agreed to, and a copy of the withdrawal slip. It was starting to look like a legal case, because maybe it needed to be one. After all, how do you fight back against people who've weaponized love, who hide behind family titles while siphoning away your future? You fight with facts. By late afternoon, Ryan stirred. He looked at me groggily, his voice raspy. "Did you tell Mom?" "No," I said flatly. "But I will." His eyes flinched. "Please don't." "Why not?" He stared down at the blanket. "She'll just make it worse, or lie, or turn it on you." That sentence hit harder than he realized, because it wasn't a guess. It was a memory. "Then maybe I don't tell her," I said carefully. "Maybe I tell someone who can actually do something." "You mean, like a lawyer?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just tell the truth. To everyone. And let the chips fall." Ryan closed his eyes again, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't argue. That night, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, research tabs everywhere. Texas elder abuse laws, financial exploitation statutes, power of attorney clauses, conservatorship options. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was building a plan. And this time, I wasn't going to ask for permission. The next morning, the knock at the door came just after 9. It was Caroline. Not a text, not a call, not even a warning. Just her, standing on the porch like it was any other Saturday, holding a brown bag from the bakery and wearing that forced half-smile she always used when she wanted something. I didn't open the screen door. Not right away. "Oh, come on, Lena," she said through the mesh. "You haven't been answering. I figured I'd just come by." I opened it slowly, just enough for her to slip past me into the house, like she always did, without permission, without pause. "Brought Grandpa his favorites," she said, lifting the bag. "Cinnamon raisin, no nuts." "He's still sleeping." She glanced around. "Where's Ryan?" I said nothing, let the silence hang like smoke. Then she turned, narrowed her eyes, and said it, lightly, almost as a joke. "You didn't go dragging him out of some hole again, did you?" I stared at her, unblinking. "He was overdosing in Maxwell Thompson's bathroom." The smile slipped. I continued. "There were crushed pills, half a vodka bottle, and kids passed out downstairs. You want pictures? I took some." "Lena." "No," I cut in. "You don't get to talk first this time." Her lips parted like she might defend herself, but I wasn't interested. "I know about the money, Mom. The 30 grand you took from Grandpa, the loan under his name, the credit cards with his Social Security. I found the statements." Her voice dropped. "He gave us permission." "No, you asked, and he said he'd think about it. And when he didn't say yes, you took it anyway." She stepped back. "You're twisting things." "Am I?" I walked to the dining table and opened the folder. "Because here's the withdrawal form with your signature, and the hospital bill that never existed, and the texts you sent Ryan asking him to tell Grandpa he needed rehab again." Her face went pale, not just embarrassed, cornered. "You think you're doing what's right," she said softly. "But you don't know everything. You're not a parent. You don't know what it's like to watch your child spiral and feel powerless." I almost softened. Almost. Until I remembered Grandpa's face when he showed me that empty bank statement. Until I remembered the way Ryan had looked curled on the bathroom floor. "I'm not powerless," I said. "And neither was he. You made us feel that way so you could keep control." The room pulsed with quiet. Then she said it. "You've always had a martyr complex." And that was it. I stepped forward. "You need to leave. Lena. Now." She held the bag out like it could fix something. I didn't take it. She left it on the counter and walked out, the screen door slapping shut behind her. I didn't move. Not right away. I waited until I heard her car pull away, until the silence settled again. Then I turned back to the folder and added today's note to the timeline. Because the gaslighting was over, she could call me dramatic, call me heartless, but I had the truth now, and I wasn't letting it go. The hours after she left felt like aftershocks. Every footstep in the house echoed louder. Every rustle of the trees outside made me tense. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. And clarity has a strange weight, heavier than doubt, because once you see the truth, you can't pretend you didn't. I sat with Grandpa that evening as the sun set, warming the front porch in soft orange light. He rocked gently in his chair, a blanket over his knees, his gaze unfocused. "Caroline came by," I said quietly. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I thought I heard the screen door." "She brought cinnamon raisin, no nuts." He chuckled once. She remembered. I hesitated. Then, "She also lied. About the hospital bill, about the loan, about Ryan needing rehab again." His hand twitched against the armrest. "I know," he whispered. Those 2 words shattered something inside me. "You knew?" "I may be old," he said, turning to me. "But I'm not blind. I just didn't want to believe it. Not for my own daughter." We sat in silence for a while. Then I said, "I want to take legal steps. To protect you. To put financial power back in your hands. If you'll let me." He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in weeks. "You'd do that?" I already started. That night, while he slept, I drafted the documents. I wasn't a lawyer, but Jasmine connected me with a colleague, Monica Tran, elder law specialist based in San Antonio. Monica reviewed everything and offered to meet us via video call. The next morning, I sat Grandpa down at the dining table with my laptop. Monica's face filled the screen, warm, firm, professional. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "Lena has brought me up to speed, and I want to reassure you, you are not alone. What your daughter has done isn't just wrong, it's illegal. You have rights." Grandpa shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to get her in trouble. I just want peace." "And that's exactly what we'll aim for," Monica said gently. "But peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from protection." She guided us through every step. Power of attorney reassignment, freezing the bank account, reclaiming the credit lines, filing a fraud alert with the credit bureaus. When we were done, Grandpa looked tired, but also lighter. "I thought all this was behind me," he murmured, "that I'd spend my last years quietly." "You still can," I said, squeezing his hand. "But this time, on your terms." As I closed the laptop, I realized something had shifted, not just in him, but in me. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing defense. I wasn't begging for truth or fairness. I was enforcing it. That night, I slept without setting an alarm. For once, I didn't feel like I had to wake up ready for a fight, but I also knew the next one was coming, and I would be ready. The calm didn't last. It was barely 3 days after we finalized the paperwork that the storm hit. It came in the form of a text message, just one line from Caroline. "You ungrateful little girl, you'll regret this." I stared at it, heart racing, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed everything I'd tried for years to deny. This wasn't just about financial stress. This wasn't about helping Ryan or managing Grandpa's affairs. This was control, and I had just taken it from her. That same afternoon, Jasmine called me from her office in Austin. Her voice was tight. "Lena, your mom's been calling around. I got a call from one of her friends. She's spinning some story about how you're manipulating Walter, that you forced him to change his will." "She what?" "She's saying you're isolating him, that you're setting him up to take everything." I sat down hard on the edge of the couch. "She's laying the groundwork," Jasmine continued. "If this goes legal, she wants to be the victim." I felt like I couldn't breathe. For a second, all the strength I'd built up over the last 2 weeks wavered, because I'd seen this play before. The crocodile tears, the trembling voice, the rewiring of history until everyone forgot who started the fire and blamed the one who tried to put it out. I looked across the room at Grandpa, who was quietly folding laundry in the sunlight, and I knew I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. So I called Monica again. "I need to file a restraining order," I told her. "Not because I want to, but because if she shows up here again screaming at him or accusing me of abuse, I want it documented." Monica didn't hesitate. "I'll get the paperwork started. We'll also prepare a statement from Walter. He can record it on video for the court. Judges take that seriously." It felt surreal, turning my own mother into a legal liability. But surreal was better than silent. By the end of that week, I had a file on my desktop titled Protection Package. It included the restraining order request, the affidavit from Grandpa, screenshots of Caroline's messages, and even a draft of the cease and desist Monica would send if needed. I kept waiting for that feeling of guilt to crash in. It didn't. Instead, I felt clear, because this wasn't a war I had chosen, but it was one I would finish. When I tucked Grandpa in that night, he reached for my hand and said something I'll never forget. "You've given me more peace in 2 weeks than I've had in 10 years. I blinked back tears. "You don't owe me anything, Grandpa." He smiled softly. "That's what makes it real." As I turned out the light, I realized something else. This wasn't just about protecting him anymore. It was about healing both of us. The knock came early. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the sound echoed down the hallway. Firm, insistent, like someone who expected the door to open now. I froze for a beat, the mug in my hand halfway to the counter. I already knew who it was. I opened the door slowly. Caroline stood on the porch, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose despite the overcast sky. Her lips were tight, jaw locked, hair pulled back like she was preparing for court. Behind her, a silver Lexus idled in the driveway. "I want to speak with Dad," she said coldly. I didn't move. "That's not going to happen. You don't get to decide that." "I do," I said. "He's under my care now. And per the court filing, he has the right to peace, privacy, and protection from harassment." Her laugh was sharp. "You're really going to hide behind legalese? From your own mother?" "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm standing where he asked me to stand." She pushed past me before I could stop her. "Dad!" she shouted into the hallway. "It's me!" I followed her in, heart pounding. Grandpa had just stepped out of his room, startled by the commotion. He looked at me, then her. "Caroline," he said quietly. She rushed toward him. "Daddy, please. Don't let her do this to us. She's turning you against your family." He didn't flinch. "She's protecting me," he replied. I saw her blink, just once, but her hands started to shake. "All these years," she said, voice rising, "everything I did for you, and you're siding with her?" "I asked you to stop using my name to take money I never approved," he said firmly. "You didn't, so I had to stop you." "You think she's innocent?" Caroline pointed at me. "She's manipulating you for your money." "She's never asked me for a single dollar," Grandpa said. You've asked me for 43,000. The room fell silent. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Caroline's face flushed red as she turned to me. You think you've won? This isn't a game, I said softly. It's our life, and I won't let you destroy what's left of it. She stepped back like I'd slapped her. Then she turned and walked out. The door slammed behind her. For a long while, none of us said a word. Later that day, Monica confirmed the court had received our paperwork. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for next week. Caroline's behavior this morning, uninvited entry, verbal aggression, would be added to the documentation. I wanted to feel relief. I wanted to feel safe. But what I felt most of all was exhausted. I tucked Grandpa in that evening with his favorite old baseball game playing softly on the TV. As I turned to leave the room, he said, "Thank you for not yelling. That's how I knew you were telling the truth." And suddenly I realized this was what justice looked like. Not screaming, not vengeance, just a quiet truth that stood its ground. The next morning felt heavier than usual. I woke up early, not because of the sunlight slipping through the curtains or Grandpa's movement down the hall, but because something inside me wouldn't let me rest. The echo of Caroline's words still rang in my mind. You think you've won? No. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I had just barely survived something. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from me lay a printed copy of the court documents, restraining order pending, full guardianship confirmed, and Walter's affidavit in careful handwriting. I had all the proof I needed. And still, my chest ached. It wasn't guilt. Not anymore. It was the ache that comes from realizing the people you've spent your whole life trying to protect were never trying to protect you. I walked out to the porch where Grandpa was tending to his potted succulents, humming an old tune under his breath. He looked lighter, his shoulders less hunched, his movements more sure. But when he saw my face, he set down the watering can. "She's not coming back," he said gently. "I know," I replied, "but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." That was the part I hadn't been prepared for. That clarity doesn't erase pain, it just makes it easier to name. And now I had names for everything: betrayal, manipulation, entitlement, and silence. That silence was perhaps the cruelest of all. I tried to fill the house with peace, cleaning out closets, cooking actual meals, playing the jazz Grandpa liked in the evenings. We even started organizing old photo albums together, pointing out relatives, places, dates, moments preserved in ink, untouched by the lies that followed. Still, every so often, I caught myself watching the street, waiting, as if Caroline might show up again, not to argue, but maybe to apologize, to say, "I didn't know how much I hurt you," or even just, "I see now." But those words never came. Instead, I got a letter, folded neatly in an envelope with no return address. I opened it in the kitchen, my hands steady even as my heart braced for the worst. It was short. "You got what you wanted. I hope you're happy. Don't contact me again." That was it. No "Love, Mom," no signature at all. I placed it next to my coffee mug, staring at the words until they blurred. Grandpa walked in and saw it. "She's still trying to hurt you," he said. "But that letter doesn't say what she thinks it does." "What do you mean?" "It says she knows you're strong enough to protect me, strong enough to walk away." For the first time that day, I smiled, because maybe that was the truth hiding beneath it all. When people lose control over you, they don't let go quietly. They lash out, but lashing out is not the same as love, and silence is not the same as peace. Autumn crept into Milwaukee gently that year. Mornings cooler, light falling earlier, the air crisp with the scent of turning leaves. I noticed it most in the silence. Not the suffocating kind that used to follow arguments in my childhood home, but a softer one, the kind that allowed you to breathe again. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the letter arrived. Caroline hadn't called. She hadn't tried to fight the guardianship, hadn't sent another lawyer, hadn't even asked about Walter's health. It was as if we'd been erased from her life in one sweeping, bitter motion. And surprisingly, that erasure felt like relief. Grandpa was improving more than I had expected. His memory was still a delicate thing, some days better, some worse. But emotionally, he was steadier. He'd stopped waiting by the window. He no longer asked me if Caroline would come visit. Instead, we built new routines: morning crossword puzzles, afternoon walks around the block, bundled in fleece jackets and knit scarves, evening stories from his youth, some I'd heard before, others completely new, like the one about his first love at 17 or the fishing trip with his brother that nearly ended in disaster. One evening, he looked at me over his cup of chamomile tea and said, "You saved me from being forgotten." I blinked. "What do you mean?" If Caroline had her way, I would have been tucked into some home I didn't choose, my accounts drained, my voice ignored. But you see me, every version of me. That moment broke something open in my chest, a kind of validation I never knew I needed. For so long, I'd been the caretaker, the fixer, the one who held the pieces together while everyone else let things fall apart. But now, someone saw me. Not just what I did, but who I was. A few nights later, I found an old journal in one of Grandpa's storage boxes. Yellowed pages, worn spine, his handwriting messy but full of emotion. It was a letter to my grandmother, written the day she passed. I sat there on the floor, the journal resting in my lap, as I read his grief, his gratitude, his regret. He had loved deeply. He had mourned honestly. And through every line, I saw a man who had always known how to feel. He'd just been surrounded by people who didn't know how to honor it. Much like me. That realization felt like an invisible bridge between us. We weren't just grandfather and granddaughter. We were survivors of the same kind of silence. And together, we were learning to fill it with truth. The first snowfall in Milwaukee arrived quietly, settling softly onto rooftops, lawns, and streets, blanketing our neighborhood in a peaceful hush. That morning, as I pulled back the curtains in the kitchen, the soft glow of fresh snow took my breath away. Grandpa Walter stood beside me, staring out the window. His eyes softened with nostalgia. "Your grandmother loved mornings like this," he said softly. "She dragged me outside before the sun was even up, bundled in layers, insisting we walk before the snow was disturbed." A smile tugged at his lips. She said everything felt possible after a fresh snowfall. I looked at him, realizing I was seeing a side of him that had been buried beneath years of worry and neglect. Now, uncovered, it radiated warmth and strength. The man who stood beside me wasn't fragile or broken. He was resilient, perhaps more so than anyone else I knew. "Do you want to walk?" I asked quietly. He turned, eyes shining. "You'd humor an old man?" "I'd follow you anywhere," I whispered, feeling the weight of truth behind those simple words. Bundled in coats, scarves, and hats, we stepped out onto the porch. The snow crunched gently beneath our boots, each step leaving behind crisp footprints. The air was sharp and fresh, carrying the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. We walked slowly, arm in arm, the silence comfortable. As we passed familiar houses, some decorated early for Christmas, I thought about how much had changed in just a few months. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking through the peaceful quiet. "Regret what?" I asked softly. "Standing up to her," he said, eyes fixed ahead. "Losing what you lost. Choosing me." I stopped, turning to face him fully. His eyes searched mine, genuinely needing reassurance. "I lost an illusion," I said carefully. "I lost a story I'd been telling myself, but I gained something real, something honest." He squeezed my arm gently. "That takes courage." "I learned it from you." We continued down the street, the falling snow softening the world around us. With every step, I felt lighter. The bitterness and anger that had once felt like an anchor around my heart had begun to dissolve, replaced by something softer, hope. When we reached the end of the block, Grandpa paused, turning his face up toward the gently falling snowflakes. "Maybe your grandmother was right," he said. "Maybe days like today mean new beginnings." I smiled softly, feeling tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "Maybe," I whispered, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. "Maybe it's finally our turn to start over." As winter settled deeper into Milwaukee, our routines became softer, more deliberate. The house felt different now, not just quieter, but warmer, like we'd finally allowed ourselves to fully occupy every corner. It felt safe. In early December, Grandpa asked me to help decorate the living room for the holidays. We unpacked boxes of ornaments, worn stockings embroidered with names, strands of lights tangled in careful knots from years of use. Each item carried its own quiet memory, a gentle tug at the heart, reminding us of seasons long past. We worked slowly, carefully, laughing softly over broken ornaments and old photographs tucked away in boxes. At the bottom of one box, my fingers brushed something unfamiliar, an old sealed envelope, yellowed with age. I glanced at Grandpa. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing it immediately. "I wrote that," he said quietly. "Years ago, for you, when things started getting hard at home." My heart quickened. "You wrote me a letter?" He nodded, eyes tender and vulnerable. "I never knew how to say it aloud, so I wrote it down." I gently opened the envelope, fingers trembling as I unfolded the paper. Grandpa's familiar handwriting filled the page, shaky but strong. "Lena, I know life at home isn't easy. I see your strength, your quiet bravery. You're allowed to feel hurt. You're allowed to be tired. And above all, you're allowed to choose yourself. One day when you read this, I hope you know that choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you free." I looked up at him. Tears blurred my vision. "You saw me," I whispered. "Even then." "I always saw you," he said softly. "Even when I didn't have the words." We sat quietly in the glow of the Christmas lights, snow falling gently outside the window. The silence held warmth now, not sadness, filled with an understanding that had finally found its voice. That night, after Grandpa went to bed, I placed the letter carefully on my nightstand. It felt like a gift from the past, a lifeline he'd thrown me long ago, finally landing in my hands exactly when I needed it most. I realized something powerful then. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't follow a tidy timeline. Sometimes it's messy and slow, coming in fragments, like a letter written years ago, opened exactly when you need it. But it always comes, eventually, if you're brave enough to wait. And as I lay there in the soft glow of winter moonlight, the weight I'd carried for years felt lighter, not gone entirely, but no longer heavy enough to hold me back. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely ready to step forward into a future defined not by survival, but by peace. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, Milwaukee had settled deep beneath a soft, heavy blanket of snow. The city streets glowed quietly under the pale gold of streetlights, every window filled with soft, comforting lights. Inside our home, Grandpa and I sat beside the fireplace, watching the flames flicker gently. Soft jazz music played in the background, his favorite album. The scent of cinnamon and cloves drifted from the kitchen, warm and familiar. It was the kind of evening I'd secretly longed for my entire life. A holiday without tension or arguments, without unspoken bitterness clouding every conversation. Just peaceful silence, filled with quiet affection. Grandpa broke the comfortable stillness first. "You've given me back something I didn't think I'd have again," he said, staring into the fire. I turned, watching the reflection of flames dance softly in his eyes. "What's that?" "Dignity," he said simply. "The chance to be myself again, instead of someone else's burden." His words gently squeezed at my heart. "You were never a burden," I said quietly, my voice trembling slightly. "You were the strongest part of my life." He looked up, his expression tender. "And you were mine." We sat quietly for a while longer, the logs crackling softly, snow gently tapping the windows. The world outside felt distant, wrapped in a comforting, protective quiet. I realized then that healing wasn't just about facing truths or winning battles. It was about reclaiming ordinary moments like these, learning to fill them with something genuine and real. Finally, Grandpa spoke again, voice hesitant. "I'm sorry for everything you had to carry alone, Lena. It shouldn't have been yours to bear." I reached over and gently took his hand. "You carried it too," I whispered. "In your own way. We carried it together." He nodded softly, squeezing my hand. "Maybe that's how we survived." My chest tightened, not with sadness, but gratitude. For the first time, I saw our story clearly, not defined by what we'd lost, but what we'd managed to protect, each other. That evening, as snow continued gently falling, we watched an old movie, sipping warm cider, laughter filling the quiet corners of the room. For the first time, I didn't wonder about Caroline or Ryan. I didn't look toward the door, didn't brace for interruption. Tonight belonged solely to us. When I finally helped Grandpa to bed, he paused at his bedroom door, turning toward me slowly. "Promise me something, Lena," he said gently. "What's that?" I asked. "Promise you'll let yourself be happy. Promise you'll believe you deserve peace." Emotion filled my throat, warm and heavy. "I promise." As he disappeared into his room, the truth settled within me, steady and quiet. I meant every word. It's been just over a year since I stood on that icy sidewalk, duffel bag in hand, heart split open by betrayal. Back then, I thought I was losing everything. Now, I realize I was being given the chance to reclaim what I never truly had, a life built on honesty, love, and self-worth. There's a different kind of strength that grows when you stop begging to be chosen and start choosing yourself. I used to carry the weight of everyone else's decisions, Mom and Dad's silence, Connor's chaos, Caroline's comparisons. I kept trying to earn love through sacrifice, as if shrinking myself would finally make space for someone to see me. But what I've learned is this: love that has to be bought isn't love at all. Today, my life looks very different. Grandpa's health has improved with proper care and attention. We renovated the back porch just in time for spring, and he spends mornings there reading the paper, humming old tunes. I started volunteering at a local addiction center, not to fix Connor, but to understand my own wounds and support others trying to break cycles too. And quietly, without much fanfare, I've begun sketching again. Small things, but mine. For a long time, I thought healing meant closure, that I needed apologies or explanations to move forward. But closure isn't something you're handed. It's something you create when you decide your peace matters more than understanding why someone refused to give it to you. The biggest lesson I've taken from this journey? You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for protecting your peace. And you are never wrong for choosing yourself after years of being asked to disappear for others' comfort. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, please know you are not alone. You are not too much, too sensitive, or too demanding. You are simply someone who finally decided that your voice deserves space, that your pain deserves acknowledgement, that your love deserves to be reciprocated. I used to think my story was about being the daughter who was left behind, the sister who was sacrificed, the granddaughter who almost vanished under obligation. But now I know my story is about becoming the woman who said enough and meant it. Thank you for walking this road with me. Your time, your empathy, your open heart, it means more than I can say. And if my story resonated with you, please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. You never know who might need to hear this next. Let's keep building spaces where healing is possible and where the forgotten finally get to speak. This was Lena's story, but it could just as easily be yours, and trust me, that's where the real power lives.